The room turned quiet as the slightly older human man walked in, the eyes from those present focusing on him with a variety of emotions and reasons attached to the curiosity they showed for this new arrival that had stolen Zishadi's entrance. Not everyone even knew who Finn was. In fact, it was likely that most of them probably didn't. However, the mere reaction of the one who had gathered them all here to his arrival was more than enough to allow everyone to guess that it was probably someone important, in one way or another. James stood in baffled shock at his uncle's sudden arrival for a few seconds, which was admittedly less than he would have expected himself. However, once he had shaken the emotional wallop in record time, he took swift steps forward, closing the gap in the span of a breath, and immediately wrapping his arms around the man who had raised him. Finn chuckled as he returned the embrace, the typical raspy hoarseness of his voice fully present and accounted for, even in just that simple sound. "I guess you did miss me," he then said in continued amusement, patting his nephew's back with a flat hand, firmly enough that the wide back of James's jacket sounded like a drum under the impact. "Could have fooled me, considering the lack of cause. I guess you gotta put up a friendly face when you can't just push a button to get rid of me." James pulled away from the hug slightly. He exhaled slowly, not in any rush to try and defend himself, though he did open his mouth to explain, which got exactly nowhere, as Finn's hand came up and pressed against his forehead, pushing his head back a bit, and thoroughly establishing that no words on the topic were necessary. "Well, what am I expecting?" Finn instead continued on with his jest, furthering his train of thought as if nothing had happened in the meantime. "You're a real big shot now, after all. Can't be taking too much of your precious time. Don't worry, no. I'm used to it. Happened with the first brat I raised as well." With that, Finn glanced over at his sister, with a gaze that didn't even know what the word subtlety was, smirking at the Admiral with a simultaneously teasing and loving gaze. James smiled, not really at the sarcastic jest. He had heard that one plenty of times in the past. No, it was just Finn's presence that immediately lifted his mood. And not just his literal presence, as in him physically being here, but also the aura he had about himself. He was still the old Finn, of course. His unkempt greying hair and the barely ordered stubble on his chin weren't exactly the living picture of vitality, and the dark bags under his eyes that more than rivaled James's own certainly didn't do him any favours on that front either. However, there was still something different about the way he carried himself now when compared to the last time they had met. There was a strength behind his movement and demeanour, and alertness he had seemingly lacked before. A spark. "Well," James said, and weighed his head for a moment before following Finn's gaze over to the Admiral. "I have to admit, you do have a pretty good record." Finn's first reaction was to chuckle, like he usually would, at whatever comment he expected James to make. However, the noise was quickly replaced by a double take, as Finn's gaze twitched back to James, and then over to the Admiral again, then repeating that back and forth a few times, his face shifting to a not unappreciative confusion. "Huh?" he said, needing to give voice to his surprise. Then he nudged his flat hand against James's shoulder, seemingly needing to add a physical aspect to it as well, as his baffled expression slowly shifted into a surprised but very genuine smile. "What was that? Who are you, and just what did you do to my nephew?" James chuckled. Except for maybe Nia, Finn was of course the one who had been the most caught in the middle and at the front lines, whenever the battles between James and his mother were raging, so James couldn't entirely blame his uncle for the disbelief he showed at even such a harmlessly casual interaction. "A lot has happened," he informed, before putting a hand behind Finn's shoulder, leading him towards the larger group, many of whom were already whispering to each other about who that man was and why he was here exactly. "I guess my sister dearest has some things to answer for," Finn commented to that, not resisting at all as James led him over to the mostly human part of the group at first. "In due time. I was serious when I said I didn't want to take too much of your time." As he looked over to the awaiting group, Finn's expression darkened a bit as his eyes landed on Nia, who heavily relied on her crutch to keep herself upright at that moment. She would probably need to sit down for a bit quite soon. Finn was of course in the loop about everything that had happened to her, but James assumed that didn't exactly help a lot when being confronted with it in person. It was, of course, not the first time one of his wars had been shot and was in the midst of recovery. Not by a long shot. But it was the first time for Nia, and even despite all their usual insistence that the bond the two of them shared was nowhere near the level that James and his uncle had with each other, there was no denying that Finn would go to war for his unofficial niece in a heartbeat. Ignoring even the Admiral, he loosened himself from James and walked up to her with steady steps, immediately pulling her into a supportive hug that took most of her weight off her feet, while also being careful not to squeeze her too much. Nia didn't say anything to him. She simply returned the hug for a moment, burying her face in his neck, which was made a little bit harder by the fact that they were basically the same height, even when Finn wasn't lifting her. James exhaled slowly as he saw the scene, feeling his heart beat just a little harder for a second. However, it didn't take long before he felt a nudge against his arm. Turning his gaze over to its source, he saw that Sheeda had appeared at his side, a gentle and very slightly awkward smile on her face, as she nodded in the direction of the assembled Offworlders who had come at his beck and call. "Everyone's waiting for you," she reminded him, in a tone that was both gentle and urging at the same time. And she was right. As pleasant of a surprise as this reunion had been, there really wasn't the time for it right here and now. And in the end, he wasn't going anywhere anytime soon, so the time for it would come. As he began to walk with Sheeda towards the elevated podium at the head of the room, he just about picked up how the exchange between Nia and Finn began in the distance. "But how? What about the compound?" she asked, her tone happy, but also worried about what his being here might mean. "The Coings were so nice to watch the place for me for a bit," Finn replied, and James could imagine how he glanced over at Coco while saying it, likely giving her an appreciative nod for the support of her parents and other family. "Said your kids need all the help you can get." It didn't take long until James had reached the podium, though it took another moment for the attached, automatic elevator to lift him up along its single track. It would have probably been faster to just climb on it, but he would save those sorts of theatrics for another time. Once he was on top of the podium, he was greeted by a suitable marking engraved into its surface, in the middle of which was a large but subtle button. At its size, it would have been easy enough to press with a finger for many larger people, but James could comfortably use his entire foot to push it down, as he took his place in the marking's center. As he pressed the button down, a very gentle humming started to fill the room, subtly indicating that speakers had been activated, somewhere hidden behind the wall's paneling. "Hello everyone," he greeted loudly, as soon as he was sure that the system was actually running, and he wouldn't make a fool of himself by trying to talk at people who could barely hear him. Though, to his credit, he did suppress the urge to clear his throat before talking, just to test if the mic was actually picking him up. To his satisfaction and admittedly relief, everything worked flawlessly, and his voice came out from the speakers in a buttery, smooth manner without any sort of crackling or interference. "First of all, allow me to thank you all so very much for coming. I know it is by no means a matter of course that you have all answered my invitation, and I would like to assure you that I have no interest in disrespecting the trust you put in me with your appearance, or in wasting your time here." As he talked, it took a moment before he had the full attention of everyone, as hushed conversations were quickly finished between individual participants, before they quickly turned their gazes up at him to listen to his impending speech. There was a mix of emotions on their faces. Morgoth and Ajaxia looked at him like they expected James to say something that had the intensity of 1,000 suns attached to it. Levexar looked skeptical but intrigued, clearly having come here on a benefit of the doubt kind of mindset. Zishiji and Gianora seemed amused yet curious. As established allies of him and his policies, those two didn't really need any further convincing to support him, so they seemed mostly interested in how fetching this pitch of his would really be out of a sense of pure curiosity. Tharivel and Quiz were similar in that department, though they seemed less amused about whatever James's idea of how to proceed was, and more carefully optimistic, with their postures remaining candid as they listened. James had admittedly somehow missed the exact moment that Lawson Runner had climbed off him again, though he suspected it was at some point during his being stunned earlier. Either way, by now the smaller primate had seemingly been allowed to ascend another one of his new allies, and he was holding onto Durofriend's tusk, which was as thick as his entire body, with all four of his arms, as his eyes gently glowed while he affixed them onto James. Durofriend himself and Ajifianora both seemed tense, but also hopeful. In truth, it was hard for James to read their wide-open and nearly black eyes. However, he knew that the expression they had right now was one he had never seen on the face of the High Matriarch during his longer interaction with her, and therefore he chose to attribute it to hope. And of course, Simon was filming the entire thing, with Nicola standing a few steps in front of the camera to be in the shot, putting on an appropriately determined and focused expression to show just how hard she was listening to the possible future viewers. As for everyone else, well, James smiled. He knew he didn't have to worry about everyone else. However, he continued his train of thought once he had taken in everyone's expression, committing them to memory as this was a moment he knew he would want to remember, for one reason or another. While I'm not looking to waste your time, that doesn't mean every one of you is going to cheer in a moment. If I'm being honest, I have no idea how diverse what I called you here for might be. Excuse me for being vague right now, but before I divulge any information, I want to get one thing out of the way first. Now he did clear his throat, and he briefly pulled on the hem of his jacket just to give his hands something to do, as he inwardly prepared for the next step. Not that he was all too nervous about it. This was the decision he had made, and he was pretty confident in it. Still, the slight sting of a suspicion that he might be standing here alone in a moment after everyone ran out from disagreement with his plans did tingle in the back of his mind. However, the times in which he had listened to whispers like that were long over now. This is not a matter of, if you're not with me, you're against me. He finally made his declaration once his heartbeat had calmed back down after just a few seconds. This is an idea I had, not one that you need to follow. I thank you all for being here, but if you feel like my plan is one you do not want to support for one reason or another, I completely understand. He then briefly pointed down towards Simon, or more precisely his camera. As you have probably noticed, this is all being recorded, he said, on the off chance that anyone had missed that part. He even waved the camera for a moment, as if to acknowledge the people that weren't yet on the other side of the footage, but might soon be. Therefore, what you are about to hear in here, everything that you are about to hear in here, is not a secret matter. If you feel like that is what you ought to do, if it is what your conscience tells you, you can walk out of here and report it to whomever you want. You can go to any publication, any official, you can scream it out on the streets. There will be no hard feelings over it. This is not a sinister plot. This is not a matter to try and bring down the system. This is a statement. One that you can want to be part of or not without any influence on what I think of you as a person. He once again paused briefly, after getting all of that out, though this time it was not out of some twinge of nervousness. Instead, he wanted to give everyone a chance to allow his words to sink in and think about them for a moment. A couple of glances were exchanged between the participants, though it seemed like no one was mumbling to each other just yet, and the eyes soon returned back to him. Everyone clear? He still couldn't quite help but ask, just to be sure. All kinds of nods and other confirming gestures were returned to him pretty quickly, and it seemed like his words had been understood. Although he couldn't quite know for sure how honest they were being, there was a hint of pride rising up within James when he saw just how quickly they seemed to take him by his word on something like that. He knew from personal experience how quickly someone telling you they wouldn't be mad led you to be even more wary and suspicious around them and their intentions. Just like someone telling you to trust them, it quite often had the exact opposite effect. Therefore, seeing how everyone here seemed to have the necessary confidence in him and his intentions to believe it when he started out with something like that, yeah, he had to admit it. It felt good. "All right," James then said, letting out a deep exhale as he did. "With that out of the way, allow me to explain." About half a uniform day after his pitch, James once again found himself on top of a very similar podium, though this one was not confined in a separated and private conference room. This one was out in the open. Well, as out in the open as was possible, on a space station at least. The stage his podium was erected on had been put together at some point between now and his arrival, and considering its size, James wasn't sure just how impressed he should be about that. It was pretty barren overall, literally just a stage without much fanfare or pizzazz to it, but darn, it was big. Now in front of him, he no longer saw the hopeful and intrigued faces of his allies. Instead, he was looking into thousands of faces that stared back at him with great anticipation. It was impossible to tell if more of the faces were hostile or sympathetic. Unlike back on Earth or Gerra-Litten, the crowd hadn't been separated into political camps, meaning those who were for and those against him all intermingled in the crowd, leaving James to only hope that it would stay relatively peaceful. Not knowing whether he should expect a tough crowd or not was, of course, not exactly encouraging, especially considering what he was about to reveal today. However, he had made his bed, and he was resolved to lie in it. The official announcement of him as a councilman had luckily gone over relatively well, though that might have been because everyone already knew it was about to happen. The true official call had basically been a formality, which probably meant that those who were going to get very angry about it had likely already done so a while ago. That same thing really couldn't be said for what he was about to reveal next. Granted, maybe he was building this up into a much larger thing than it actually was in his mind. However, well, he had also seen people get really angry about a lot less than what he was about to pull. As always, it was a flip of a coin. "Thank you, Acting Councilwoman Laura Polither," was the first thing that came over James's lips, as he briefly turned to bow at the Xanthai, who had been the one with the questionable honour of announcing his ascendance into the acting council. He had been sceptical of her, back when they had first met, much like he had been sceptical of everyone who his former captors had deemed to be of interest when it came to pushing him as their political pawn. And in many cases, his skepticism had turned out to be more than justified. However, with this core welder specifically, he was quite glad that he had seemed to have been wrong in his assumptions. And so, he gave her a more directly appreciating nod of his head as he watched her purple plumage slowly walk into the background, leaving the stage completely to him. As James returned his gaze to the crowd, he allowed it to wander across it for another moment, taking in the faces of those who admired, those who despised him, and those who were looking at him with a clear undecidedness of whose side they truly wanted to be on. Faces of all kinds, large or small, horned or smooth, furry or scaled, trunked or flat, hard or soft, they all were looking at him. One thing that was reassuring was that, even in this enormous crowd, there were those who still stood out to him. Morgoth, Agia and Duralfren were all hard to miss. Granted, so was the Nafmir Duralfren who had insisted on being a menace during his arrival. However, another unimpressed-looking Jir was far easier to ignore than the well-meaning gazes of familiar faces. Additionally, no matter where he looked, there were always more human soldiers, walking around in between and around the crowd and securing the premises. He has said it before, of course, but once again he had to reaffirm it to himself. They weren't taking any chances this time. And thank all of you for your numerous appearance. James finally addressed the crowd from the top of his podium that overlooked even the very largest among them, though ironically that only made him feel even smaller as he stood up there. It is no secret that I am a controversial figure, and I know not all of you are here out of joy to see me succeed. However, I am honored to have your attention nonetheless." As expected, there was an immediate, quite mixed response to his words, as a figurative wall of sound echoed back towards him, with some of the crowd loudly professing their support, while others wanted to set a very clear sign that they were not here for any friendly reasons towards him, and exactly where he could shove his thanks for their attention. Undeterred, James allowed the noise to die down a bit again, before continuing in the exact cadence from before. "I am not quite sure what sort of speech you are expecting out of me," he admitted, and of course his hands constantly moved to sign what he said as he spoke the words. There were, of course, interpreters signing along with him, inside of some studio as well. However, he would take the chance to bring his words to the people himself, even if it meant that he would have to speak a little bit slower, as he also focused on the signing, which also pulled some focus on his uncovered mechanical hand, as the grey appendage starkly stood out from the rest of his pale white skin that could be seen peeking out from under his suit in the few uncovered areas. Usually, I would expect to thank those who elected me while accepting a position like this. However, here I find myself in a position of nepotism, and honestly, I wasn't really quite sure how to handle that. There was some murmuring going through the crowd, as his words apparently kicked loose a very brief debate about what did and didn't qualify as nepotism here. At least it seemed like his statement had softened the mood of a few people, as they accepted that he wasn't going to claim any glory for himself from the position that he now held. Though, it was really just a few. In fact, I was so unsure that I really didn't even know whether I wanted to come here or not, James continued openly, shifting his stance a bit as he made full use of the little room that the button under his foot gave him to play with to move around slightly while talking and signing, not wishing to appear as some sort of talking head here. "And you can trust me. I asked a lot of people, even my mum. And you know things are desperate when I'm asking my mum." A chuckle went through the friendlier part of the crowd, while James quickly shook off the very strange feeling that developed on his tongue after referring to his mother as mum for the first time in close to exactly 11 years. Certainly odd to do it during a political speech, and certainly only possible for him to even consider because of some very recent events, but he knew there was a huge difference in the way you came across while up on stage between saying mum and mother. And, well, the fact that mum was the better fit for the way he wanted to present himself today gave him a good excuse to carefully test the waters with the term, even if his immediate gut reaction told him that he probably wouldn't start to casually use it any time soon. "But in the end, most people who I asked gave me the same answer," he continued his little anecdote opener, still keeping it casual for now. "It's your decision," they said. "Can't make that choice for you. Even the people of our government back home told me to do what I think I can use best." Can you imagine? The government saying, "We'll keep our fingers out of that." Another wave of chuckles, though this time there was a grumbling undertone coming along with that. "I know some of you really can't imagine that, and I can't blame you. I'd probably be right there with you," he admitted, in a tone that he tried to keep both dismissive and acknowledging somehow, with no idea how well he actually pulled it off in the end. "But whether you believe it or not doesn't really matter in the end. I mean, fact is, I'm here now for whatever reason that may be." He took a deep breath. Now it was time. "And you're probably all far more curious about that reason itself than about how I came to it," he said, his voice turning away from his light-hearted casualness as it became a bit firmer and sterner, shifting more into a realm people were familiar with from other speeches of his. This, of course, caused the people to listen up even more than before, immediately picking up on the fact that the important part of his speech was about to begin. At least their faces told him that his assessment was right. "I'll keep that part short," James explained, his shifting and movement slowly dying down as he stood straight, and his signing also became more precise and to the point, instead of flourishing his movements out a bit. "I thought a lot about this. Thought a lot about what would be the best way to use the opportunity granted by a position like this. It is the highest one anyone can have in the galaxy right now, after all. And that's crazy to think about. He waved his head from side to side, breaking eye contact with the crowd, as he briefly went into a bit of acted-out brainstorming. I could try to push all kinds of policies and do my best to get a running start on fulfilling many of the promises that I made during my campaigning, he suggested, with his head leaning to the left side, before rolling it over to his right and continuing with, or I could use this platform to reveal as many of the possibly shady dealings that go on behind the scenes and which I now have access to. He then lifted his head up again to look right at the crowd. I mean, if all goes well, I'll hold this acting position for a maximum of something like 2 weeks. And who knows what is going to happen after that? He elaborated further, his hand swinging into a shrug for a moment before returning to his signing. That's not a lot of time, and given how many people are counting on me to be their voice, I should make the most of it, right? He paused for a moment, as if he actually expected an answer from the crowd. A low murmur swept across the thousands of people who watched him, even if no one felt the need to loudly shout an answer back at him. Once he felt like he had given the rhetorical question enough air to breathe, he continued. But then I thought, that really isn't a lot of time. And I am just one man, he said, deliberately letting his head hang a bit. I mean, yes, this is a momentous occasion as the first Deathworlder ascends into the council. But in the end, I'm just one councilman. One of over 100. What kind of big change could I hope to achieve in 2 weeks that this sitting council wasn't willing to implement within the last however many years they were in power? Let's face it, I would have to think pretty damn highly of myself to just assume that I could sway over half of them to see things from our perspective within as little as 2 weeks. And I'm not delusional enough for that. Not anymore, at least. He briefly glanced over at the familiar form of the Admiral, who overlooked the crowd from the stage just like he was, though a good few measures off to the side. With a broken clock being right 2 times a day, he had to admit that he had learned his lesson, whether he liked it or not. No, I had to do something else, he said, both to the crowd and a little bit to himself, as he finally gave voice to the thoughts that had buzzed around in his mind for a while. He had explained his plan to everyone before, yes, but now was the first time he actually fully walked through his thought process. Something that is within my power as one councilman. He smoked a bit as he looked straight ahead. And, well, then it hit me. Power, he said. Power is a funny thing in this galaxy. There are a lot of systems in place that are supposed to determine and regulate it, and it is a system that has at least worked for quite a long time. However, I have to say I'm not all that happy with it. He briefly interrupted his speech so he could make a sweeping gesture over the crowd with one arm without interrupting his signing. Only once he was done did he speak again. I think it is not crazy to say that this current election is the first real one that many of us, maybe even most of us, have ever lived through. I certainly was born long after the last one, and so were all the people I currently call my confidants, some of whom are quite old. So this is also the first time that many of us are confronted with the rules and regulations of a galactic election. Again, it certainly was for me. He closed his eyes for a moment and released a slow breath before he opened them again, leveling his gaze onto the crowd. The first thing I thought when I read the rules for a galactic election for the first time was... He then opened, building anticipation with a brief pause before releasing it again as he said, "This was made to be abused." A sound of inhales went through the crowd, and James could only figure that those came from the more gullible part of the people listening to him right now. He was sure he was by far not the only one who had ever had that thought. Then again, maybe it was just the fact that he would simply say it on such a public stage was what had people shocked. Who knew? It is a system designed for the people of power. It makes it easy to stay in power but hard to gain it, and it has many ways to ensure that those who are in power have the necessary tools to help those they want to see among themselves overcome those hurdles. He explained, for those who may have been slower on the uptake. After all, this whole speech was useless if he didn't get what he was doing across to the people listening. So what is my power as a single councilman? And how do I best use it? He rolled his head for a moment, standing up a bit straighter than before. It's true that I should make the most of my position as a councilman, he said, very openly to the crowd, focusing on a few individual faces as he talked to better gauge the reactions. But instead of trying to use the full 2 weeks, I think I can do a lot more if I just make the best use of the next. He paused briefly, no longer speaking for a moment as he had to break up his signing in order to briefly pull out his phone and check the clock. 14-ish hours. He finally finished his sentence once he had put his phone away, his hands once again free. The split reactions were immediate, confusion and understanding appearing in equal measure, and quite clearly differentiating who was and wasn't picking up what he was putting down. Yes, about 14 hours, he said, because that is when Phase 1 of the election will officially end, exactly 1 uniform month and week after its announcement. Until then, it is still possible for people to officially enter the electoral race with their own candidacy. James couldn't help but smile as he once again saw the different reactions to his words. Some people raised their eyebrows in an almost impressed way as they understood what he was insinuating. Others became a bit pale around the muzzle as it sank in for them as well, and yet others seemed entirely confused. Now you might be thinking, he therefore kept elaborating, what does it matter? How will anyone get over the threshold of 5 billion votes with a measly 14 hours? Well, he once again paused dramatically, waiting for a few more people to realize it themselves before he kept talking. The votes don't actually matter, he then finally stated that which was obvious to some, but seemed mind-blowing to others. Any acting councilperson can announce their candidacy without needing to clear the votes threshold. And, if you read a little closer, there is nothing that says that the candidacy will be any less valid if an acting councilperson resigns from their position. A resigning from the council is usually connected to pulling out of the candidacy as well, but it is not codified anywhere. If an acting councilperson resigns, their candidacy is just as valid as it was during their time in office. Any time in office, I might add. Because apart from some paperwork, there is no rule that says how long you need to have been a councilperson for it to count either. He put on a casual smile as he ran his gaze across the crowd. I only need to designate someone as my successor and resign, and like that, he said, snapping his finger at the end of the signed word, we have another cleared candidate. The bluntness with which he announced it seemed to have most of the crowd stunned, even if some of them excitedly or agitatedly whispered to each other, seemingly trying to gauge if he was being serious or not. There was a lot more to it as well, James continued, pretending like he didn't notice the crowd's reaction as he went through a bit of a thought exercise. For example, the no vote is wasted policy means that if I made someone a clear candidate that way, who already had votes from people supporting our policies, that would mean those people's votes are suddenly free again, and would probably go to someone else who has a similar mindset, who might have otherwise not cleared the threshold. But we don't even need to go that far to see just how easily the system can be exploited. Briefly, his eyes found those of Nuff Mirdulfren. He didn't know what reaction he had expected out of the large societal spool. However, James wasn't quite sure if he should be concerned by the fact that the man appeared to be amused by his speech. His 6 eyes were narrowed slightly, and his split trunk was raised into a Y shape. He even briefly waved with it, as he seemingly noticed that James was looking at him. Sure as hell was different from his predecessor, that one. Still, he couldn't allow himself to be distracted or flustered by that. Even if we just go for the most basic route of putting people into the race that I want in there, I estimate we could get around, let's say, a conservative 30 people into the race within those 14 hours, James established, and once again allowed that number to sink in for a moment. With 137 open seats in total, that is not a bad number at all, especially considering that people who are going to vote for me are also likely to vote for the people who I put in place as well, he then went on. Of course, the system has never actually been used like this before. Not to this extreme at least, and that makes sense. After all, if you put a system like this into place, you do best to be quiet about it, so no one is going to have all that much of a desire to try to change it. If you play your cards right, you and your politics can just coast along for a long, long time, while subtly making use of this to make sure the right people stay in power. But, well... He once again interrupted himself just long enough to shrug. I'm in a position of power now, he said. And call me greedy, but I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't abuse a system, literally made to be abused at least a little bit for my advantage. Again there was murmuring, much louder this time. Had it not been so all over the place, he might have even been able to make out some of the things that were being thrown back and forth. I am not going to put 30 candidates into place, though, James then explained, in a slightly reassuring manner. For my purposes of showing just how badly this system needs to change, it would be more than enough to do it one time. I wouldn't do it at all if I felt like I was betraying anyone. If there was no interest for people with my stance, I would simply leave it at calling this problem out. However, I am in the very lucky position to have multiple people in my close company who have already handily cleared the 5 billion votes threshold. Therefore, I feel assured that there is enough demand for people of my political allegiance to allow myself to add just a few more into the mix. A few people whom I have asked beforehand, and who have agreed to take the step for the betterment of the galaxy. He rolled his shoulders and stretched for a moment, his smile turning more casual again, just like it had been at the start of his speech. As my official act as acting councilman, I hereby declare the Honourable HFY Emenimara Tua as my official deputy and successor, he announced into the microphone, his voice sweeping across the crowd. This time, it didn't seem like Nuffmere Dualfriend found his words all too funny, as his held-up trunk suddenly dropped, while his eyes widened a bit. And, just as a hint, James then said, the smile on his face growing at the small satisfaction of having gotten a rise out of that guy in the end. My next official act will be to step down. Another pause, the last one he intended to take. The tension over the crowd was palpable. He crossed his arms, writing out the feeling filling him right now. Was it good? Was it bad? He really didn't know. But it sure was filling. Any questions? He then finally said, uncurling his arms to sign the question as well. Before he had even finished the last sign, a flood of raised hands broke across the crowd, like a crashing wave.